Wichita, Kansas, February 2005. For more than 30 years, investigators had been searching for a man who seemed to understand one thing extremely well: how to disappear. He had entered homes, taken lives, left behind carefully guarded details, and then written to newspapers and police as if the investigation were a private contest between himself and the city. Then, for years, he went quiet. No arrest. No public confession. No face to attach to the three letters that had frightened Wichita: BTK. By 2005, detectives had mountains of old reports, preserved evidence, psychological profiles, and decades of theories. What they did not have was the killer. Then something arrived. A computer floppy disk. It looked ordinary, but hidden inside information the sender apparently believed had been erased was a name: Dennis, and a connection to a church. After more than 3 decades of trying to remain anonymous, the man behind BTK had made one of the simplest mistakes imaginable. But to understand why Dennis Rader would eventually hand investigators the clue they needed, we have to return to Wichita in 1974, when almost nobody knew that a predator had begun watching people from the ordinary streets around them. Wichita in the early 1970s was a growing Midwestern city. Families went to work, children left for school, neighbors recognized one another, and residential streets offered the sense of normalcy people expected from everyday American life. Dennis Lynn Rader was living within that world. Born in Kansas in 1945, Rader had served in the United States Air Force between 1966 and 1970. He later married, had children, studied at Wichita State University, and built the outward appearance of an ordinary family life. Nothing about that public identity warned Wichita what was developing behind it. According to accounts, Rader later gave investigators, and in court, he had violent fantasies long before the public knew his name. Eventually, fantasy became preparation. He began observing potential victims. He later described this process in disturbing, almost administrative terms. He referred to people he targeted as projects. He would notice someone, watch routines, study homes, and consider opportunities. And in January 1974, one of those so-called projects became the beginning of the case that would haunt Wichita for decades. Joseph Otero and his wife Julie lived with their children on North Edgemoor Street in Wichita. On the morning of January 15th, 3 of the older Otero children had already left for school. At home were Joseph and Julie, along with 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. Dennis Rader had been watching the family. That morning, he entered their home. Rader initially presented the situation as a robbery, but what followed was not a robbery. Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Josephine, and Joseph Jr. were killed. Later that day, the older Otero children returned home and discovered what had happened. 4 members of one family had been murdered inside a house on an ordinary Wichita street. Investigators had a major crime scene. What they did not yet know was that the person responsible wanted something beyond avoiding capture. He wanted recognition. Months later, in October 1974, a letter connected to the Otero murders reached the Wichita Eagle Beacon. The writer included details that had not been publicly released. That meant investigators could not dismiss the message as an ordinary hoax. Someone with knowledge of the crime was communicating with the outside world. The pattern that would eventually define BTK had begun. Less than 3 months after the Otero murders, another attack occurred. On April 4, 1974, 21-year-old Catherine Bright returned to her Wichita home. Rader had selected her after noticing her previously and had begun treating her as another potential target. But something happened that Rader had not planned for. Catherine was not alone. Her brother Kevin was with her. Rader confronted them. Kevin survived the attack. Catherine did not. Her death became the 5th murder eventually attributed to Dennis Rader. The fact that someone survived an encounter with the killer was significant, but the investigation still did not produce an identity. And then the killings associated with him appeared to stop, for nearly 3 years. There were no confirmed BTK murders in 1975, none in 1976. To investigators, that did not necessarily mean the danger was gone. It simply meant they did not know what the person responsible was doing. Then came March 1977. On March 17, 1977, 24-year-old Shirley Vian was at her home on South Hydraulic Avenue. Her children were there too. Rader entered the house. The children survived. Shirley was killed. Years later, Rader would describe how he moved around Wichita looking for potential targets and abandoned plans when circumstances were wrong. That detail makes this case especially unsettling. The people who became victims were not necessarily selected because of some connection to him. Sometimes, according to his own later account, he simply noticed someone, watched, waited, and decided. By 1977, Wichita still did not know the identity of the person behind these crimes. But before the year was over, Rader would kill again, and this time he would personally make sure authorities knew about it. Nancy Fox was 25 years old and lived on South Pershing Street. Rader had been observing her. On December 8, 1977, he entered her home and killed her. Then he left. But shortly afterward, emergency communications received a call reporting the homicide. The caller was the killer. His voice was recorded. Investigators now had something extraordinary, the voice of the man they were trying to identify. Yet even that was not enough. There was no modern nationwide digital network instantly comparing voices, movements, surveillance footage, and personal records. Police work depended heavily on interviews, physical records, traditional forensic evidence, and the enormous process of eliminating suspects. And Rader was preparing to make his public identity even more notorious. The killer wanted Wichita to know him. Not Dennis Rader, but BTK. Communications linked to the killer began revealing something unusual. He was paying attention to media coverage. He wanted his crimes recognized. And he wanted a name. The letters BTK came from his own description of his crimes: bind, torture, kill. The name entered Wichita's consciousness. Now the threat had a label, but still no face. In January 1978, the Wichita Eagle-Beacon received a poem referring to Shirley Vian's murder. Other communications followed. Rader wrote about the crimes, complained about publicity, created puzzles, and used a distinctive BTK signature that investigators deliberately kept secret for years. That hidden signature became useful because police could distinguish authentic communications from people pretending to be the killer. BTK was not simply trying to escape investigators. He appeared to enjoy communicating with them, and that desire for attention would eventually become one of the greatest weaknesses in his attempt to remain hidden. By 1979, communications from BTK stopped. Years passed. Wichita changed. Detectives retired. Children grew into adults. Technology advanced. But the killings remained unresolved. Investigators continued working the case. During the 1980s, a renewed police effort, sometimes known as the Ghostbusters, revisited BTK using newer investigative techniques, including computer databases, psychological profiling, and advances in forensic testing. Police invested enormous amounts of time into the investigation, but the central question remained unanswered. Who was BTK? And there was another question nobody could answer with certainty. Had he actually stopped killing? The answer, authorities would later learn, was no. By the 1980s, Dennis Rader was living in Park City, just north of Wichita. He was a husband and father. He worked. He participated in community life. And one of his future victims lived nearby. Maureen Hedge lived on the same street as Rader. On April 27, 1985, Rader killed her. Her disappearance triggered a search. Her vehicle was discovered days later. On May 5th, her body was found in a rural area northeast of Wichita. Years had passed since the murders that first made BTK notorious. But the same man was still active. and his neighbors had no idea that one of the most wanted killers in Kansas was living among them. On September 16, 1986, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle was at her Wichita home. Rader approached the house using a cover story. He killed her inside, but investigators initially could not definitively connect her death to BTK. Unlike the publicity-seeking communications of the 1970s, there was no immediate message establishing responsibility. The case remained unresolved, and for years, the Wegerle family lived without knowing who had killed her. What investigators also did not know was that Rader possessed evidence capable of proving he had been inside that house. He would eventually provide it himself, but not until 2004. Dennis Rader's final confirmed murder occurred in January 1991. Dolores D. Davis was 62 years old. Rader had noticed her and, according to investigators' later account of his confession, turned her into another of his so-called projects. On January 19, 1991, he killed her. Her body was later discovered away from her home. That brought the confirmed number of Rader's victims to 10. Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Josephine Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle, Dolores Davis. 10 people murdered between 1974 and 1991, and after Davis's death, the confirmed killings stopped. This is one of the most disturbing parts of the BTK story. Dennis Rader did not spend those decades living as an obvious fugitive. He lived publicly. He had a wife, children, employment. He had served as a Boy Scout leader. He became involved with Christ Lutheran Church and eventually served as president of the congregation. He later worked for Park City as a compliance supervisor dealing with issues including animal control and local code enforcement. Residents encountered him as a city employee. Church members knew him as a fellow congregant. Neighbors knew him as the man who lived nearby. Meanwhile, investigators trying to identify BTK had no idea that Dennis Rader was the man they were searching for. And Rader might have remained unidentified for much longer if he had continued doing one thing: nothing. But in 2004, something changed. January 2004 marked 30 years since the Otero family murders. The Wichita Eagle published coverage looking back at the case. The story revisited a terrifying chapter of Wichita history and raised questions about what had become of BTK. Was he dead? In prison for another crime? Living somewhere else? Had he simply stopped? Dennis Rader saw the renewed attention. For a man who had once mailed messages to newspapers and police, being treated like a figure from the past apparently mattered. In March 2004, an envelope arrived at the Wichita Eagle. Inside was material concerning the 1986 murder of Vicki Wegerle. There were copies of photographs that investigators concluded had been taken by her killer. There was also a copy of Wegerle's driver's license, an item that had disappeared from her home. And there was the secret BTK signature. After roughly a quarter century without a confirmed public communication, BTK was back. For Wichita police, this changed everything. A cold investigation suddenly had an active suspect communicating in the present. And modern investigators had tools their predecessors in 1974 could barely have imagined. Over the following months, BTK sent additional packages and messages. He communicated with television station Kake. He submitted documents, puzzles, and materials connected to his crimes. At one point, a package associated with BTK was left near a Home Depot store. Investigators examined surveillance footage from the area. A dark Jeep Cherokee became significant. Police eventually connected the vehicle to Rader's family, but investigators were still building their case. They needed to know who the man behind these communications was, and so an extraordinary psychological contest developed. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, who led the BTK investigation, understood that the killer's desire to communicate could be exploited. Police responded publicly in ways designed to keep him engaged. The more BTK communicated, the more opportunities existed for him to make a mistake. And eventually he asked the question that changed the case. Could a computer floppy disk be traced? Rader wanted to communicate electronically, but he was concerned that doing so could expose him. He therefore asked police for reassurance. Investigators provided it. In a coded newspaper response, police indicated that using a floppy disk would be safe. It wasn't. In February 2005, a package reached television station Kake. Inside was a purple floppy disk. Rader believed he had removed the information that could identify him, but deleting a file does not necessarily remove every trace of the information associated with it. Investigators examined the disk using digital forensic techniques. Hidden metadata associated with a deleted document produced something astonishing. A name, Dennis, and an organization, Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators searched for the connection. The president of Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita was a man named Dennis Rader. After more than 30 years of mystery, police suddenly had a real person to investigate. The floppy disk had not solved the entire case by itself, but it had pointed investigators directly toward a man whose life could now be examined against everything they knew about BTK. The killer, who had spent decades trying to control what police knew, had accidentally given them his first name and his church. Investigators began following Rader. They studied his background, his vehicles, his movements, his connections. The Jeep seen in connection with the Home Depot package could be linked to his family. Then investigators sought biological confirmation. Using a subpoena, authorities obtained access to a biological sample belonging to one of Rader's close relatives. The DNA analysis indicated that the unknown BTK killer was genetically related to that person in a way consistent with Dennis Rader being the suspect. The digital clue and genetic evidence were converging. After decades of false leads, profiles, and unanswered questions, police were no longer searching across Wichita for an unknown man. They were watching Dennis Rader. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader left his home in Park City. Police moved in. The man who had eluded investigators since 1974 was arrested. Dennis Rader was 59 years old. The arrest stunned Wichita. The mysterious BTK was not some vanished drifter. He had remained in the community. He had raised a family, worked for local government, participated in church, lived an outwardly ordinary life while one of Kansas's longest-running murder investigations continued around him. Investigators searched his home and other property. They recovered extensive materials associated with his crimes and fantasies, including items linked to victims. The search helped confirm what the floppy disk and DNA evidence had already suggested. BTK had finally been identified, and during questioning, Rader began admitting responsibility. There was one detail about Rader's capture that revealed just how confident he had become during his correspondence with police. He had asked whether the disk could be traced. Police had effectively told him no. He trusted the answer. After his arrest, Rader confronted investigators about it. Why, he wanted to know, had they lied to him? For decades, he had treated law enforcement communication almost like a game in which he could establish rules. But police had never agreed to play by his rules. Their job was to identify a murderer. And once Rader voluntarily reopened communication, investigators used his need for attention against him. The same man who had carefully avoided identification for decades ultimately trusted the detectives hunting him to tell him whether his evidence could expose him. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. On June 27, 2005, he appeared before District Judge Greg Waller. Instead of proceeding toward a full trial, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty. Then the courtroom heard something Wichita had waited more than 3 decades to understand. Rader began describing his crimes. He explained how he selected victims, how he watched them, how he prepared, how he abandoned plans when circumstances were unfavorable, and how he referred to prospective victims as projects. His tone was strikingly procedural. For families who had lived with uncertainty for decades, the identity of BTK was no longer a mystery. But hearing that identity explain the murders brought a different kind of pain. On August 17, 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. He was not eligible for the death penalty for these crimes because Kansas did not have capital punishment in effect when the murders occurred between 1974 and 1991. His sentence effectively ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. It is tempting to say that one floppy disk caught Dennis Rader, but the truth is more complicated. The disk was the breakthrough. It gave investigators the name Dennis and the connection to Christ Lutheran Church. But the capture resulted from decades of accumulated police work, preserved forensic evidence, renewed communication, surveillance, vehicle evidence, digital forensics, and DNA analysis. Most importantly, police had recognized something fundamental about the person they were hunting. BTK wanted attention. During the 1970s, that desire helped create his public identity. In 2004, it drew him back into communication. And in 2005, it encouraged him to send the very object that exposed him. Technology had changed dramatically between the beginning and end of the investigation. When the Otero family was murdered in 1974, personal computers were not sitting in ordinary homes. There was no Google search, no modern consumer digital trail, no routine DNA profiling. 31 years later, investigators could recover information from a deleted computer file, search an organization almost instantly, and use genetic evidence to test whether their suspect fit the biological evidence. Dennis Rader had survived the investigative world of 1974. He underestimated the investigative world of 2005. Perhaps the most unsettling fact about the BTK case requires no description of violence at all. For decades, people in Kansas wondered what kind of person BTK might be and where he had disappeared to. The answer was that he had not disappeared. He was living among them, working, attending church, raising children, holding positions of responsibility, interacting with residents as a local government employee. He was not identified because someone recognized a monster walking down the street. He was identified because the anonymous killer returned to the spotlight, continued communicating, asked police whether a floppy disk was safe, and believed their answer. For 31 years, Dennis Rader controlled one of Wichita's darkest mysteries. Then, in a matter of weeks, technology, forensic evidence, and his own ego stripped that anonymity away. The story of BTK is therefore more than the story of a serial killer who avoided capture. It is also the story of an investigation that survived generations of detectives and technological change. Families waited decades. Officers spent years chasing fragments. Evidence waited for science to catch up. And eventually, the man who had once challenged authorities to identify him gave them the clue that led directly to his door. BTK wanted Wichita to remember his name. History remembers another fact just as clearly. Dennis Rader was finally caught because he could not remain silent.